The desert was a shattered landscape littered with burned vehicles and broken concrete, and the SEALs crouched behind the last remnants of a fallen bunker, their eyes scanning the smoke-filled horizon as if expecting death to emerge from every shadow, and Sergeant Miller could feel the tension pressing down on him like a physical weight, his muscles taut and his breath coming in short, jagged gasps as he tried to calculate the distance between them and the approaching enemy, yet the smoke obscured everything, making it impossible to know how many were coming or from where, and he cursed under his breath, wishing for a miracle, while every instinct screamed that time was running out. And then a distant metallic roar cut through the haze, a sound unlike anything he had expected, and it made him freeze because it was familiar yet impossible, and the men around him stopped moving as well, their training locking them into silence as they tried to discern the source of the sound. And the desert seemed to hold its breath as if the world itself recognized the arrival of something extraordinary that might change everything, yet they could not be sure if it would save them or leave them exposed to something far worse. A corporal Hayes pressed his back against the cold concrete, scanning the sky where the roar had originated, and his fingers tightened around his rifle, his knuckles whitening because the sound was growing louder and heavier, like a storm rolling in over the mountains, and he could make out a silhouette through the thinning smoke, a dark shape moving with intent yet battered by the haze that distorted its edges, and he realized with a shock that it was an aircraft, yet its motion was wrong. It did not move like a standard fighter jet or transport plane. It seemed to drag itself forward as if every wing beat required a struggle against an invisible weight, and for a brief moment Hayes wondered if it was a hallucination, a cruel trick of exhaustion. But when the shape resolved into the unmistakable frame of an A10 Warthog and the faint glint of metal caught the dying sun, he realized it was real and still fighting to reach them. The men whispered to each other, their voices hushed, not because they feared being heard, but because they could not tear their eyes from the approaching aircraft, and Sergeant Miller felt a surge of disbelief and awe mixed with fear as he realized that the A10 was limping through the air, fuel trailing from one engine and smoke curling off the other like a wounded beast refusing to fall, and he could see scorched panels along its fuselage, dents and holes that should have grounded it, yet here it was holding together somehow, defying all reason, and for a moment even the desert seemed to pause, listening to the thrum of its engines carrying it forward through the sky, and he knew instinctively that whoever was piloting it had decided that nothing would stop them from reaching this battlefield. And the men around him felt it too, the unspoken knowledge that help was coming, but in the most unlikely and dangerous form imaginable. The aircraft dipped lower, closer to the ridge lines, the roar echoing across the valley, shaking loose pebbles and dust, and Miller felt a knot tighten in his stomach because the approach was too low, too risky, and yet somehow the pilot maintained control, and Hayes pointed toward a cluster of enemy positions preparing to fire, and he knew the pilot had seen them because the Warthog adjusted its trajectory slightly, banking to avoid the worst of the fire, and the men realized with growing astonishment that it was not here by accident. It was coming deliberately to confront the threat head-on, and Miller could almost hear the engines roaring a defiant challenge, as if the aircraft itself was declaring that it would not be defeated no matter what forces lined up against it, and the SEALs felt a flicker of hope rise despite the danger that pressed around them. Smoke from the burning vehicles and shell craters rose in thick columns that twisted and coiled in the wind as if trying to reach the heavens, and the aircraft cut through them, leaving trails of turbulence that rippled the clouds above, and Miller felt his pulse spike as the Warthog drew nearer, its wingtips dipping dangerously low over jagged rock formations, and the fuel trailing behind it shimmered in the sunlight like molten silver, and every second that passed made the SEALs hold their breath tighter because they knew the aircraft was damaged beyond reason, and yet it kept moving forward as if powered by sheer will, and Miller could not stop imagining the strain on the pilot inside the cockpit, the hands gripping the controls, the muscles screaming in protest as the machine refused to fall, and he realized that this was more than a plane, it was a living testament to defiance against impossible odds. Hayes shifted slightly, trying to get a better line of sight, and the ground beneath him vibrated as the engines drew closer, and he could see smoke streaming from the wing tips and the pilot maneuvering to avoid the worst of the obstacles, and for a moment the SEALs felt as though they were spectators too. Something sacred, something that had broken the rules of survival and now hovered above them, ready to intervene in a battle that seemed already lost, and Miller raised a hand to signal the men to remain low because the aircraft would draw fire, and any sudden movement could be fatal, and the enemy had already begun preparing a response, their positions now aware of the A-10 and the SEALs alike waiting for the moment when the pilot would commit to the ground, and the men could only watch, frozen in anticipation, wondering whether this impossible machine would survive long enough to impact the battle. The A-10 leveled off just above the highest ridge, scraping over the treetops in a motion so precise and dangerous that Miller felt a cold sweat break across his back, and the roar of the engines seemed to vibrate through his bones as the aircraft lined up for a pass directly over the enemy lines, and the smoke trailing from its engine intensified a thick black ribbon that caught in the wind and twisted as if alive, and the men could see the pilot inside leaning into the controls, her figure tense and focused, the plane wobbling but not collapsing, and Miller knew in that instant that everything they had feared might be undone by sheer stubbornness, because the pilot refused to be beaten, and every eye in the squad followed the arc of the plane as if hypnotized by its struggle against the very air itself, and the desert seemed to hold its breath alongside them. The enemy fired their first salvo, an uneven spray of bullets and shells aimed at the low-flying aircraft, and the explosions sent showers of rock and dirt into the air, and the A-10 shuddered violently as the rounds struck its fuselage and wing, and Miller gritted his teeth, watching the impossible continue unfolding, the engines coughing smoke and flame, but the craft held together and adjusted its trajectory inch by inch to maintain its path, and the SEALs could not look away even though they knew the next moments would determine whether their own lives were spared or if this miracle would end in a blaze of destruction. And still the aircraft pressed forward, its damaged frame responding to commands it should have been incapable of executing, leaving Miller unable to predict whether it would strike true or collapse entirely in a storm of fire and metal. The valley below erupted in chaos as the A-10 released its first rounds, the sound of violent staccato that cut through the roar of the engines and smoke and dust, and the enemy scattered under the unexpected attack, and the SEALs felt a surge of adrenaline wash over them, realizing that for the first time in hours they might have a chance to regroup and escape, and Miller could feel the tension crack slightly like ice underfoot, and Hayes whispered in disbelief that it was still flying and still fighting despite everything, and the aircraft tilted sharply, banking to avoid the worst of the terrain, and Miller held his breath, once more hoping that the pilot would survive the final approach, because if she fell now all hope would vanish from the valley, leaving only smoke and silence in her wake, and the SEALs remained frozen, unable to do anything but watch as the impossible unfolded above them. The A-10 completed its pass, skimming dangerously close to the treetops, its fuselage streaked with smoke and flame, and Miller watched with mounting awe as it began to ascend again, gathering whatever speed and lift remained in its crippled engines, and for a brief moment the men thought it might not hold together, yet the craft stabilized, the nose lifted slightly, and the pilot adjusted controls with careful precision, and the SEALs realized that the aircraft was still alive, still fighting, still refusing to yield, and Miller felt a lump in his throat, knowing that the battle was not yet over, but that salvation had arrived in a form no one had dared imagine, and the smoke continued to rise from the battlefield, curling around the plane like a shroud as it prepared for its next move, leaving the men suspended in anticipation of what would happen next. The A-10 hung above the valley like a wounded predator, its engines straining with a low roar that rattled the rocks beneath the SEALs' feet, and Sergeant Miller could feel the vibrations through his chest as the craft adjusted its course inch by inch through the smoky haze, and every movement it made seemed impossible, as if the laws of physics were bending to the stubborn will of the pilot, and he swallowed dryly because the aircraft could not possibly survive another hit, yet it pushed forward dragging trails of black smoke that twisted and curled through the hot air like living things, and Hayes whispered under his breath that it was still alive, and the men felt the tension in the valley tighten like a drawn wire ready to snap. At any second the enemy scrambled to reposition, trying to anticipate the path of the low-flying aircraft, and Miller realized with mounting horror that the A-10 was coming directly for the center of their formation, daring to expose itself to every gun emplacement that had been trained on them since dawn, and he felt a cold sweat run down his spine because the pilot was not attempting to flee but to strike, and with each moment the aircraft drifted closer to the ground, the danger for everyone in the valley increased exponentially, and he gritted his teeth, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing on him because he could do nothing but watch helpless as the damaged craft bore down on the enemy, leaving a wake of smoke and heat in its path, and the SEALs instinctively crouched lower, as if pressing themselves to the earth could somehow make them invisible to the chaos descending from the sky. The A-10 tilted sharply, banking around a cluster of jagged rocks, its fuselage wobbling dangerously with every adjustment, and Miller felt his stomach drop because one wrong move could send the entire aircraft tumbling into the valley and end the last hope they had, and yet somehow it held together, the pilot inside guiding every motion. With painstaking precision, muscles trembling, hands tight on controls, sweat stinging her eyes, and he realized that the courage and skill required to keep that plane in the air at all was beyond comprehension, and even the enemy forces faltered at the sight of the smoke-streaked aircraft daring to come so close despite its crippled state, leaving a momentary lull in the gunfire, as if everyone recognized that this was no ordinary battle. SEAL's eyes followed every movement of the plane as it leveled out, skimming over the treetops, and Miller could see the fuel trailing from the engines like molten silver and sparks flickering along the panels where rounds had struck, and he thought about the pilot inside fighting every second to keep her craft from breaking apart, and he felt a strange mixture of fear and awe because the next moments could decide life or death for everyone in the valley, and he whispered to Hayes to keep low and to watch the angles as the A-10 prepared for its next pass, knowing that the enemy would react immediately, and with lethal intense roar of engines grew louder as the aircraft leveled and accelerated, skimming past a series of enemy positions, and Miller felt the ground tremble beneath him as the bullets and shells the enemy fired missed the plane but tore into the surrounding rocks, sending plumes of dirt and debris into the air, and the smoke that had been curling lazily now twisted violently in the turbulence of the low-flying aircraft, and for a moment Miller could not breathe. He felt the valley shrink around him, and the SEALs felt an almost hypnotic awe as the damaged A-10 wove through the battlefield, refusing to fall, defying every expectation of what a crippled plane could do. Hayes adjusted his stance, trying to track the aircraft as it made a sudden banking turn around the largest bunker cluster, and Miller noticed the careful way the pilot kept the nose low while adjusting the throttles to compensate for the fuel loss and the heavy smoke that poured from the ruptured wing tips, and he realized that the pilot was not just attacking but calculating every movement to avoid catastrophic failure, and still she pressed forward through the hail of enemy fire. And Miller felt a tightening in his chest as adrenaline and disbelief collided, because the entire valley seemed to hold its breath waiting for the outcome, and the SEALs remained motionless as if acknowledging that this was not a battle of men but of sheer will. The enemy regrouped quickly, realizing the aircraft was still operational and preparing concentrated fire along the path of the low-flying plane, and Miller felt a lump in his throat because the A-10 was now dangerously exposed, and any direct hit could send it spiraling into the earth, and yet the craft kept moving, its wings wobbling but maintaining altitude, its engines choked with smoke and fuel leaking in streams behind it, and the pilot leaned into the controls with grim determination, adjusting every minor twitch to keep the aircraft on course, and the SEALs could only watch, frozen in awe, as if the air itself had become electric with tension and uncertainty. The A-10 dipped sharply, targeting a cluster of heavy weapon emplacements, and Miller felt the reverberation of the guns through the soles of his boots as explosions erupted around the low-flying aircraft and smoke and flame rose to meet it, and he flinched as the fuselage wobbled violently under the impact, but the aircraft held together and the pilot executed a strafing run, sending the rounds into the enemy positions with precise accuracy despite the crippled state of her engines, and every second she remained in the sky added precious time for the SEALs to move and regroup, and Miller felt a flicker of hope rise like a fragile flame against the darkness of the battlefield, and yet he knew it was a fragile hope and any second could bring it crashing down. The aircraft pulled up, sharply banking to avoid the next ridge line, and Miller could see the twisted panels glinting in the sunlight, fuel trailing behind it like a comet, and sparks flickering where the bullets had struck earlier, and he realized the pilot had no margin for error, no room for hesitation, and the SEAL's eyes tracked every motion of the craft as if memorizing a miracle unfolding in real time, and still the enemy fired every weapon they had trying to bring down the impossible machine, and each explosion threatened to end the fragile thread of survival holding the aircraft aloft, and Miller clenched his fists, unable to tear his eyes away. A's whisper that the pilot must be exhausted beyond comprehension, yet still fighting every second to stay airborne, and Miller felt the tension in his chest tighten because he knew the next moments would determine whether they survived or whether the A10 would fall in flames, leaving the valley to the enemy, and yet the aircraft refused to falter, wobbling through the haze and smoke and fire with an almost unnatural determination, and the SEALs felt a momentary shock of unity, a silent acknowledgement that whatever this pilot possessed in skill and will had kept them alive this long, and now their fate balanced precariously on the next maneuver. The A10 leveled for a final pass, the engine straining to hold together, its fuselage streaked with smoke and flame, and Miller watched with bated breath as the pilot lined up for another strafing run, knowing that one miscalculation would destroy the craft entirely, and the men instinctively pressed against the earth, holding their positions frozen as though their stillness could somehow aid the aircraft in its desperate assault, and the enemy scattered in confusion under the surprise of the low-flying attack, and the SEALs realized that for the first time in hours they might have a chance to escape the tightening noose of the battlefield, and Miller could not stop the disbelief from rising in his chest. The aircraft began to ascend again, engines roaring, the smoke trailing in thick twisting ribbons across the valley, and Miller felt the vibrations through his chest as the craft adjusted its course to make another pass over the remaining enemy positions, and the men could not move their eyes from the sky because the sight was almost unbearable in its tension, almost too much to witness yet impossible to look away from, and the pilot inside leaned further into the controls, muscles straining, her face set in grim determination, the plane wobbling slightly but still fighting, and Miller swallowed hard, knowing that every second held the potential for death and hope in equal measure. The A10 executed a final banked turn, its nose dipping low for one last strafing run, and Miller felt a cold sweat break across his body as the aircraft roared over the valley, unleashing its remaining rounds on the enemy, and smoke and debris rose in thick clouds to meet it, and the men could hear the almost supernatural wail of the engines straining to hold together, and Hayes whispered disbelief at the sight, and Miller felt the tension snap slightly as the enemy positions began to break under the assault, leaving a fragile path of survival opening before the SEALs, and yet the aircraft continued to wobble in the smoke trailing behind it, knowing that the danger was not yet past, and every moment held the potential for the impossible to end. The A10 descended slowly toward the cracked desert floor, smoke curling off its wings and trailing in thick black ribbons as though the aircraft itself was dragging the battle behind it, and Sergeant Miller felt the ground vibrate beneath him as the engine strained against the weight of damage and fuel loss, and every muscle in his body tightened as the plane approached the small clearing beyond the shattered bunkers, and he could see the enemy scattering in panic, knowing that the flying machine would reach them before they could react, and Miller swallowed hard and whispered to Hayes to hold position because any sudden movement now could be fatal, and the men froze as the A10 hung in the air like a wounded bird refusing Tafal's pilot leaned into the controls, her hands trembling, her arms taut, as she guided the crippled machine over the valley floor, sparks flickering from scorched panels and fuel dripping in thin streams behind the fuselage, and Miller felt a surge of awe mixed with terror, because one wrong adjustment could send the aircraft spiraling into the desert, and yet it held together inch by inch like a living testament to defiance, and he realized that survival depended not on strategy or luck, but on sheer stubborn will, and the SEALs remained motionless, absorbing every detail of the impossible craft hovering above the moss. The plane neared the final ridge. Miller could see the strain etched across its frame, the wings wobbling slightly as it adjusted to the uneven terrain below, and the smoke curling from the engines thickened with every passing second, and he could feel the heat on his face, as if the aircraft itself radiated its struggle outward into the valley. And Hayes whispered under his breath that it could not hold much longer, and Miller knew he should fear for the pilot, yet at the same time he felt a flicker of hope rise inside him that against all odds they might survive the moment and escape the battlefield. Enemy fired a last concentrated volley of rounds and shells, the sound echoing like thunder through the valley, and the A10 jolted violently, sparks flying from every exposed seam, and Miller instinctively ducked lower, fearing the worst, yet somehow the aircraft compensated each movement, precise, calculated inch by inch, and the pilot leaned forward, gripping the controls with trembling strength, and the SEALs watched in awe as the machine adjusted to the hail of fire like a living thing refusing to die. And Miller could not look away, knowing that every second might be their final chance at survival. The aircraft touched down in the clearing with a rough scrape that sent dust and rock flying, and Miller felt the ground shake beneath him as the engines roared a final defiant wail, and for a moment everything seemed to freeze, the smoke curling higher and the valley holding its breath, waiting to see whether the aircraft would collapse or remain intact. And the SEALs could not move still, crouched against the rocks, frozen in awe, as the pilot guided the damaged Warthog forward across the uneven terrain, and every wobble threatened disaster. Yet somehow the craft pressed on. Hayes reached out, gripping Miller's arm, and whispered disbelief as the aircraft slowly ground to a halt, its engines coughing and sputtering as the pilot cut the throttles, and Miller could see the smoke rising from every damaged seam, and he knew that the machine should not have survived this far, yet here it was holding together like a wounded animal refusing to die. And the SEALs felt a wave of adrenaline mixed with exhaustion sweep through them, because for the first time in hours they dared to hope that the battle might be won not through strength, but through the miraculous defiance of a single machine and the courage of the pilot inside. Miller stepped forward cautiously toward the aircraft, his boots crunching on broken rock and fuel-soaked dirt, and he could see the pilot slumped slightly in the cockpit, her hands still on the controls and her breathing heavy and uneven, and the SEALs instinctively spread out around the clearing, scanning the perimeter for any remaining threats, and the enemy had scattered, leaving only the remnants of chaos behind. And Miller realized that the aircraft had not only survived the impossible, it had also cleared a path for them to escape and live to fight another day. The pilot unstrapped herself slowly, and Miller could see the exhaustion in her movements, every step a battle against her own fatigue and the weight of the mission still pressing on her shoulders. And Hayes whispered in awe that she had kept it together through everything, and Miller nodded silently, knowing that words could not capture the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. And the SEALs slowly approached to offer support, helping the pilot from the cockpit as the engines coughed and smoldered behind them, and the smoke curling skyward like a signal that the impossible had endured. The valley seemed to exhale as the aircraft came to rest, the threat dissipating in the rising dust and smoke, and Miller felt a deep relief settle over him, mingled with disbelief, because the battle had not been won by superior numbers or superior firepower, but by sheer determination and courage of a single pilot who refused to let the battlefield claim victory. And the SEALs stood silently around the Warthog, taking in the sight of the scarred aircraft and the woman who had brought it down safely, and they knew that their lives had been spared not through chance but through her defiance, leaving them speechless in the heat of the desert sun. Hayes finally broke the silence, asking if she was going to be all right. And the pilot gave a faint nod, her voice rasping with exhaustion but carrying the quiet strength that had kept her and the SEALs alive through the hours of chaos. And Miller felt a wave of gratitude and admiration sweep over him because he understood that they owed their survival to a combination of skill, courage, and willpower that few could comprehend. And the SEALs gathered around, offering assistance and support, helping her to steady herself. And he realized that in this moment they were no longer just soldiers, they were witnesses to something that defied expectation and reason, leaving everyone suspended in awe as the smoke continued to rise behind the battered but unbroken aircraft. The desert lay quiet except for the faint hiss of escaping fuel and the gentle groan of metal settling, and Miller knew that the battle was over for now and that the valley would remember the arrival of the A10 that refused to fall. And the SEALs helped the pilot walk toward cover, their eyes scanning the horizon for any remaining threats, and Hayes whispered that he would never forget what he had seen, and Miller nodded silently, agreeing that the courage and defiance of one aircraft and one pilot had rewritten the rules of survival in this valley. And the smoke continued to curl into the sky, marking the trail of the impossible and leaving a silent promise that even against overwhelming odds, hope could still survive. The pilot finally rested against a rock, her body shaking with fatigue, and Miller offered water and first aid as the SEALs regrouped and scanned the valley, knowing that the threat could return at any moment, yet feeling a fragile sense of victory because the impossible had happened and the A10 had survived and carried them through the danger. And he could see the faint smile on the pilot's face despite exhaustion and pain, and he realized that the battle had been transformed not by firepower but by sheer courage, leaving the SEALs silent and reflective as they watched the smoke curl skyward, marking the scarred aircraft that refused to die. And the horizon seemed to hold its breath as if acknowledging the defiance that had changed everything.